Who's doing this, specifically?
Ultimately, all roads lead to those who print the money. But we know as far as the coordinating entities, certainly DoD, DARPA, and we have documents to prove the existence of these programs going back decades, documents hundreds of pages long. We have an 800-page U.S. Senate document from 1978 outlining the scope and scale of these programs then, specifically calling for intergovernmental cooperation, even between, quote, otherwise adversarial nations, because of the cross-border ramifications of these programs. You can't just geoengineer over your own country. Who's the biggest player? Obviously, the United States of America, because of the size of our military. The U.S. military has 3 times more aerial tankers, which are the primary aircraft used in these operations, 3 times more than all other militaries in the world combined. And if I could back up to the whole condensation trail narrative again, which is perhaps one of the greatest lies ever perpetrated on populations all over the world.
For decades, if you dared to suggest that the United States government was actively steering storms, manipulating the rain, or spraying chemical compounds to alter the climate, you were instantly labeled a deeply paranoid conspiracy theorist.
Now the claims are getting even more bizarre. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, a congresswoman of Georgia, is now saying the federal government is literally controlling the weather. We're controlling the weather. It's beyond ridiculous.
But what if the conspiracy theories were never actually theories at all? What if the line between natural weather and government manipulation was permanently erased over half a century ago? Recently, the internet absolutely exploded when an 18-page, highly classified CIA memorandum from October of 1965 violently resurfaced and went massively viral across social media platforms. This isn't a fake document pieced together on a fringe message board or a hoax generated by artificial intelligence. This is a declassified, authenticated, undeniably real piece of American history, bluntly titled Weather Modification. And what is written on those typed, faded pages completely shatters the illusion of the natural sky. The document contains terrifying, undeniable proof of a massive, heavily funded federal operation to actively weaponize the Earth's atmosphere. It outlines plans to launch rockets and fly heavily modified military aircraft to dump specific toxic chemicals directly into the clouds to artificially engineer local storms. It proves that the United States government actually did build a weather machine. They actually used it to fight a covert war in the jungles of Asia, and they actually tried to manipulate massive hurricanes off the coasts of the American South. To truly understand the sheer hubris and the terrifying scale of the CIA's weather modification programs, you have to mentally transport yourself back to the deep, pervasive paranoia of the 1950s and 1960s. The Cold War was raging across the globe. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a terrifying, existential nuclear arms race, constantly threatening to wipe each other off the face of the map with the push of a single red button. But behind the highly secured, closed doors of the Pentagon, military strategists were becoming obsessed with a completely different kind of weapon of mass destruction. The top brass realized that dropping a thermonuclear bomb is incredibly messy. It instantly destroys the very land you are trying to conquer. It creates a massive international diplomatic catastrophe, and it leaves behind radioactive fallout that lasts for thousands of years. The military desperately wanted a ghost weapon. They wanted a way to completely decimate an enemy nation without ever dropping a bomb, without ever firing a single bullet, and most importantly, without ever leaving a trace of American involvement. In May of 1962, then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered a commencement address to a graduating class at Southwest Texas State University, and he uttered a sentence that sounded exactly like the manifesto of a comic book supervillain. He looked out at the massive crowd, stepped up to the microphone, and stated clearly and unequivocally, "He who controls the weather will control the world." That was absolutely not a poetic metaphor. That was a stated, highly funded military objective. Imagine the tactical, geopolitical power of that concept. What if you could silently trigger a massive, unnatural, months-long drought that entirely starves an enemy nation's crops, plunging their population into famine and sparking a political revolution, all while you sit back and claim it was just a bad year for rain? What if you could conjure a localized, devastating flood that violently washes away their military supply lines in the middle of the night? It would be the ultimate untraceable act of warfare cleverly disguised as a tragic act of God. The newly surfaced 1965 CIA memorandum proves exactly how fast this terrifying concept escalated, from theoretical conversations to highly funded reality. The document reveals that federal funding for secret weather modification projects was actively set to quadruple by the year 1967. The government was quietly pouring millions upon millions of dollars into the hands of ambitious atmospheric scientists, and they were completely ready to test their new, godlike toys on the physical world. The administration was absolutely determined to beat the Soviet Union's efforts to control the weather as global tensions violently escalated. They believed they were on the precipice of mastering the ultimate weapon, completely ignoring the fact that they were tampering with a highly complex, deeply interconnected global climate system that they barely understood. By 1967, the United States military was deeply bogged down in the horrific, endless nightmare of the Vietnam War. Despite their massive technological superiority and overwhelming firepower, the U.S. was losing blood and treasure at an alarming rate. The absolute biggest strategic problem the American military faced was the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a massive, sprawling, highly complex network of hidden dirt roads, footpaths, and jungle tunnels running directly through the neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. The North Vietnamese army was incredibly successfully using this hidden trail to smuggle heavy weapons, fresh troops, and critical daily supplies down into the combat zones of South Vietnam. Because the trail was heavily shielded by dense triple canopy jungle, traditional U.S. bombing runs were proving to be incredibly ineffective. You simply cannot bomb a dirt road that your pilots cannot see from the air. The Pentagon was desperate. They needed a way to completely wash away the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and so they authorized one of the most highly classified, deeply controversial, and ecologically devastating military operations in human history, Operation Popeye. The operation's deeply cynical, dark motto was painted right on the walls of the military briefing rooms: "Make mud, not war." The strategic concept was incredibly simple, but the physical execution was devastating. The United States military deployed heavily modified WC-130 weather reconnaissance aircraft and incredibly fast F-4 Phantom fighter jets to fly directly into the massive, dark cloud formations naturally gathering over the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the Asian monsoon season. As the brave, sworn to secrecy pilots aggressively penetrated the violent storm clouds, they actively triggered specialized flare racks that had been heavily bolted to the wings of the aircraft. But these were not normal flares designed to burn bright for illumination or to distract enemy heat-seeking missiles. These specialized flares were designed to violently spew massive, microscopic, invisible clouds of silver iodide and highly toxic lead iodide directly into the upper atmosphere. This complex chemical process is known scientifically as cloud seeding. When these specific chemical compounds aggressively hit the supercooled water vapor trapped inside the storm clouds, it rapidly forces the moisture to freeze, crystallize, grow heavy, and fall to the earth as relentless driving rain. The CIA and the Air Force weren't just trying to make it rain a little bit harder. They were actively trying to artificially extend the natural Asian monsoon season by 30 to 45 days. They wanted to drown the jungle. And horrifically it worked. The massive chemical spraying operations triggered unnatural, apocalyptic downpours across the region. The relentless, engineered heavy rain violently saturated the deep soil of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, triggering massive, catastrophic landslides that instantly wiped out entire, vital sections of the enemy supply routes. Heavy transport trucks sank completely up to their axles in deep, unnavigable, clay-like mud. Critical river crossings were completely flooded, washing away bridges and drowning soldiers in the dead of night. The United States military had successfully, undeniably turned the sky itself into a highly effective tactical weapon, but the brutal, toxic reality of Operation Popeye was carefully, obsessively hidden from the American public, and for incredibly good reason. The chemicals they were blindly dumping into the atmosphere by the ton were incredibly dangerous. Lead iodide, one of the primary seeding agents used in the specialized flares, is highly toxic to human biology. Health authorities are explicitly clear that there is absolutely no safe level of exposure to lead. When it washes heavily down into the jungle soil, absorbs into the agricultural crops, and violently pollutes the local drinking water, it can cause severe lead poisoning. The devastating symptoms include intense neurological damage, chronic physical fatigue, intense abdominal pain, severe kidney problems, and permanent developmental issues in young children. The United States government was quite literally poisoning the sky and the ground directly below it, fundamentally altering the local ecosystem and exposing countless innocent civilians to heavy metals, just to win a temporary tactical advantage in a deeply unpopular jungle war. The operation was so deeply, aggressively classified that even some of the highest-ranking elected officials in the United States Congress and the State Department were kept entirely in the dark. It was conducted with zero public oversight and entirely without the knowledge or consent of the surrounding sovereign nations of Laos and Cambodia. It was a rogue, highly unauthorized manipulation of the Earth's natural climate system, and it ran continuously, unabated, for 5 long, toxic years, from 1967 all the way to 1972. The military ultimately conducted over 2,600 highly classified cloud-seeding combat flights, dumping countless tons of toxic chemicals into the delicate atmosphere of Southeast Asia. But the madness did not stop in the humid jungles of Vietnam. While the military was busy turning Southeast Asia into a toxic mud pit, a completely different, highly funded branch of the federal government was trying to play God with the absolute most powerful, destructive force on the face of the earth: Atlantic hurricanes. The 1965 CIA memo explicitly highlights the government's intense, ongoing focus on actively manipulating extreme weather events that threatened the American homeland. This massive ambition gave birth to Project Storm Fury, an incredibly ambitious, highly dangerous, and deeply flawed joint project between the United States Navy and the Department of Commerce. The deeply arrogant theory behind Project Storm Fury was that if you aggressively flew planes into a raging hurricane and heavily seeded the massive, violent eye wall with tons of a freezing agent, like silver iodide, you could artificially force the storm's massive cloud structures to rapidly freeze and physically expand. The scientists theorized that this forced expansion would violently disrupt the internal thermodynamic heat engine of the hurricane, causing the eye to collapse and drastically reducing its devastating, highly destructive wind speeds before it made landfall on American soil. In the mid-1960s, highly trained government scientists and brave Navy pilots actually strapped themselves into heavy, vibrating military aircraft and flew directly into the terrifying, violently swirling eyes of massive Atlantic hurricanes, actively dumping heavy chemical compounds into the swirling vortexes of wind and rain. The recently exposed 1965 documents specifically reference the project's highly secretive work surrounding Hurricane Betsy. Betsy was a highly erratic, devastating, and deeply unpredictable Category 4 hurricane that violently slammed into the vulnerable coasts of Florida and Louisiana in September of 1965. It caused over $1 billion in catastrophic property damage and tragically killed dozens of innocent people. The government was desperate to prove that they could leash these multi-megaton atmospheric monsters and save American cities from destruction. Historical records show that the government fully intended to chemically seed Hurricane Betsy, but canceled the flight at the absolute last minute when the storm unexpectedly shifted its path. However, because the government operated in such intense secrecy and failed to inform the press that the seeding flight was canceled, the terrified public falsely blamed the secret government project for Betsy's erratic, deadly path into Louisiana. This sparked a terrifying, lingering ethical nightmare that haunted Project Storm Fury for its entire existence. Think about the sheer, terrifying legal and moral liability of this project. If the United States government actively flies a military airplane into a massive, natural hurricane, aggressively dumps heavy chemicals into its eye wall to artificially alter its trajectory or diminish its power, and that chemically manipulated storm then suddenly veers off course and completely wipes out an entirely different coastal city, who is ultimately to blame? If the government successfully steers a Category 4 hurricane away from the wealthy, highly populated beaches of Miami, but their chemical manipulation causes the storm to violently crash into the historic city of Savannah, Georgia, did the federal government just commit an act of war on its own citizens? Is the resulting death and destruction an unavoidable act of God? Or is it a calculated, legally actionable act of the federal government? The sheer, blinding hubris required to believe that 1960s scientists, using primitive weather radar and modified FLIRs, could safely leash, steer, and control a massive atmospheric monster is absolutely staggering. Project Storm Fury was eventually, quietly shut down in the early 1980s when humiliated atmospheric scientists finally realized that hurricanes are incredibly chaotic, highly unpredictable, massively complex thermodynamic systems that absolutely do not respond to silver iodide the way they arrogantly assume they would. Eventually, the dark, highly classified truth about Operation Popeye and the CIA's vast weather manipulation programs leaked out to the public. In the early 1970s, legendary investigative journalist Jack Anderson managed to expose the highly classified Vietnam cloud seeding operations in a series of explosive, paradigm-shifting columns. The resulting public outrage was absolutely massive and immediate. The terrifying idea that the United States military was secretly poisoning the sky, violating the sovereignty of neutral nations, and playing God with the global climate horrified the entire international community. The explosive revelations led directly to furious, highly televised United States Senate hearings where politicians demanded absolute accountability for the rogue atmospheric operations. The massive global backlash directly led to the United Nations drafting and signing the NMOD Treaty in 1977, an international agreement which officially, legally banned the hostile military use of environmental modification techniques across the globe. The government officially packed up its weather machines, quietly classified the remaining embarrassing documents, shuttered the active programs, and firmly swore to the American public that they had completely stopped manipulating the sky. The official government stance became that weather modification has only ever been used to help weaken dangerous storms or induce rain in drought-stricken areas. But the deep, permanent, irreversible psychological damage was already done. The government had permanently shattered the public's trust in the natural world. Fast forward to today, when that 1965 CIA weather modification memo recently resurfaced in the news cycle, championed by outlets like the Daily Mail, and went massively viral across global social media platforms. It acted exactly like a lit match thrown onto a massive wading pool of gasoline. Millions of people looked up at the long, persistent white contrails stretching across the modern blue sky and instantly, reflexively connected the dark historical dots. The 18-page report was heavily shared by conspiracy theorists, completely validating decades of their deep-seated fears. Modern environmental researchers, skeptical citizens, and prominent, highly vocal political figures like U.S. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. have aggressively pointed to these newly viral declassified historical documents as absolute, undeniable proof of the modern chemtrail theory. They fiercely argue a very simple, highly persuasive point. If the CIA and the military were perfectly willing to secretly dump toxic lead iodide out of airplanes to aggressively control the weather in secret back in 1967, what is actually stopping them from secretly dumping highly reflective aluminum, barium, and strontium out of commercial and military airplanes today? Conspiracy theorists sharing the files have actively accused the CIA of using these ongoing projects to keep the world dependent on the government by weaponizing storms, artificially blocking the sunlight, and deliberately poisoning food supplies to intentionally make the global population sick. These massive allegations focus heavily on chemtrails, the thick white streaks seen coming from high-flying jets on clear days, which appear to spread out and dissipate very slowly, turning a clear blue sky into a milky, hazy overcast. Those long-lasting trails that turn blue skies into milky haze for hours, not condensation. That's poison falling on your family, your water, your lungs, one terrified user alleged on social media. According to figures like RFK Jr. and environmental researcher Dane Wigington, these alleged chemtrails contain dangerous toxins and heavy metals, including aluminum, barium, strontium, and even mercury. Those materials are put in jet fuel. RFK Jr. explicitly claimed in April of 2025, "I'm going to do everything in my power to stop it. Find out who's doing it and holding them accountable." Researcher Dane Wigington insists the chemtrail conspiracy is entirely real, pointing to lab tests, government documents, and whistleblower testimony. He claims airliners equipped with secret nozzles are actively weaponizing the weather, dumping up to 60 million tons of toxic nanoparticles into the atmosphere annually. Mainstream scientists fiercely push back. Meteorologists explain that these white streaks are simply contrails, harmless ice crystals formed when hot jet exhaust hits freezing high-altitude air. They categorically deny any covert global chemical spraying operations. But the viral 1965 CIA memo perfectly explains the public's refusal to listen. The government has a heavily documented history of lying about this exact topic. You cannot secretly poison the sky over Southeast Asia for 5 years, recklessly attempt to steer hurricanes, hide it all from Congress, and then expect blind trust from a sterile press release today. The U.S. military may have officially abandoned its weather warfare programs in the 1970s, but the psychological fallout is permanent. The exposed CIA files serve as a dark warning. When a government breaks public trust on a massive scale to play God with nature, it leaves a legacy of paranoia that lasts for generations.